We were talking a little bit backstage and beforehand. We've got 30 minutes. We have 6 people. So let's just each do 5-minute introductions and we're out of here. Make sense? We're doing the quick math here. We have some pretty hardcore scientists up here. I'm sure they did that 6 times 5 pretty quickly. But let's kick things off. Gosh, I've been watching the last few presentations. Actually, maybe half of them today characterize an either-or situation between attribution and mixed modeling. And then, Michael, I heard you earlier just saying, is it really the same thing or is it really different? I know you have some opinions about this. Do you want to kick off talking a little bit about how those things are different or the same?
Sure. I think we heard some essence earlier that the fundamental thing we're trying to do is understand the consumer. After all, is who the marketer is trying to influence. The goal of any of these analysis is to understand how the marketing stimuli influence the consumer to take actions, whether that's multi-touch attribution or marketing mix modeling or econometric analysis, whatever you want to call it. The fundamental or the atomic unit that we're interested in analyzing is the consumer. So this is pretty much where we should think about starting when we construct any sort of model. And I'd like to call it an econometric model and build up from this notion of an economic theory about the way consumers respond to marketing and other influencers in the marketing environment. And with that sort of mindset, we can have a consistent framework from bottom to top in a world that's built from atoms up to think about this. That's
right. And what we're really talking about at the end of the day is multi-screen marketing effectiveness. Isn't that right? Where a person is the unit in the center, and we're trying to see what all these exposures impact it has on them. So
I think there's two. One is obviously you always have to start with the data generation mechanism to understand what generates the data, and the second step then is to figure out what are the data elements that you can bring to bear on the question. The second one is, and I'm not sure it's generally agreed upon in multi-touch attribution, is what do you actually want to measure? What do you want your model to be? And I think between us here on the stage, maybe it's not true, but I think we agree that it's all about incremental causal impact of marketing activity or other drivers that are there. So it's not attribution in the sense of an accounting scheme where we try to take the outcome and distribute it amongst touch points. We do want to figure out what would have happened had I not given that stimulus, and attribute to that stimulus the portion of the outcome that's due. And so that means there is a truth behind it. We just all have different methods of trying to get to that truth.
And even when we agree that that's what we want to measure and that's what we want to do, there's still differences in terms of methodological approaches. Does anybody want to chime in and explain, like, why do we have these differences in approaches, and what are these differences?
I can imagine in several years we might get to a point where mix and attribution are the same thing. I think at this point they're feeding each other, hopefully feeding each other and trading insights. But yeah, I think we also said when we were standing outside that if we all measured the same thing, same campaign, we probably would all have different answers.
I don't think we want the general public to really know that, though, do we? But yeah, it's because of
the general public, I hope.
Different.
But we did debate as to whether or not people would make different decisions.
Right. So they would have a different answer, but they probably would make the same choices about how to improve what they were doing.
Yeah, so I think there are different methodologies as you hit on. I disagree with Leslie's approach that's a few years off of the two different models, because we've been integrated since we did the XMOS research with Jim Spaeth a decade ago. So our approach started with a person level, and I agree with the point of view that person is the unit of measurement. And what we found as we increased over time is that you could attach to a person a weather variable or the local economic variables or the stores or shopping promotions that were happening there. And so we might be in different time scales. I think we all agree that that's where it should be going, and some of us attack the problem differently from a person level so that we can integrate in with brand as well as behavior. The Citibank gentleman talked about wanting to do net promoter scores, and in his group in Citibank, they're not doing that. But in another group in Citibank, I see Mike Hurst, who I work with over there, we are doing that, connecting brand to the behavior over time. And so there are, I think what's amazing about this conference so far is that I think we as a group need to be talking more to each other and sharing what we're doing and deciding what might be common goods. Like, for example, 10 years ago, after doing the work with Jim Spaeth and so forth, we saw that there was going to be a need for design of experiments as a gold standard approach, which Mobile Marketing Association has said, yes, that is also true and important. But we realized that you're going to need to do that continuously and very, very quickly. And the patent office issued us the patent for that capability because they said, look, people have done experiments for 400 years, but no one has ever, it's novel to combine it and do that continuously. But maybe that's a patent that we should make generally available to any vendor that wanted to use it. We tried that 10 years ago, and there were no takers because the word attribution and so forth and the space hadn't emerged, but maybe now's that time to do that. So I think as we talk together and begin to say what do we have that maybe we should share or this commonality, and what do we have that's proprietary that we need to keep separate, I think this is a really healthy and important dialogue.
I was just going to ask.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Nancy to
No, I do think understanding the consumer is absolutely critical with any modeling, and I think we heard that there is room for understanding the full picture from an econometric standpoint, as well as going deep in terms of ID level. But I think pure person-centric, we just heard from Abada, can have lots of bias in it. And that's really where the art comes in. And I think we all saw with the election just how a lot of data can lead to incorrect predictions and grossly incorrect. So I think really the art and science piece, and it's great that there's a patent and you're willing to share it. And the great thing about patents is you can actually go in and look at them. So I've had the pleasure of actually seeing what you do. But it's not as simple as just a technique or a methodology. There's an art to it. And that's the piece that I think people don't truly understand, and there's a false sense of precision when it comes to data.
So I'm always a little bit concerned when people use that word art, because that becomes a black box of all the stuff that we don't want to explain to people. So it's more, when I think about this, the quote-unquote art piece is more about what assumptions about the mechanism that generated the data, and therefore about the model that you will build, do you need to make up front? Those assumptions need to be made explicit, and they need to be shared with the end user of the product, and they need to agree that those assumptions are right.
Of course, and how do you interpret
that's
it?
the art. But in the end, it's modeling assumptions. What we're doing is modeling. It's not statistics. It's a way of describing the world, and having the right description that captures all the things that can go right, but also the things that make allowances for the things that can go wrong, is very important. In the business we are in my opinion, besides all the fact that there's data issues, that just certain things you don't see, or certain things that where you collect data, you think you collect something, but the machine that collects the data doesn't really do it right, and so on. But the other two things are self-selection and targeting, that create the most biases in the data sets we have. And unless you make assumptions in your models that acknowledge them and then try to get rid of them, you can't have a proper model and a proper methodology.
It leads to another question I was going to bring up. Often when I hear people talk about attribution, it sometimes leads into the topic of misattribution. Mm-hmm. What do you think are some of the key things that are causing misattribution? I mean, one of the things I see with marketers is confusion over correlation versus causality, for example.
Yeah, we did. Some of this. I think this forum started with a debate on wonks about that very issue, and it kicked off with my colleagues over at TubeMogul with a paper by Tom Reardon, who was "Your Attribution is Broken" in Ad Exchanger, I think was the title. In case you guys want to search up and find the history. And we worked with an insurance company and with TubeMogul and some academics to dig into it, because their concern was that they were getting answers that seemed to be biased towards bottom of the funnel activities, and they were not seeing much money flowing towards top of the funnel. And this is where I think control groups become so important in figuring out incrementality. TubeMogul had a brilliant idea, which was to traffic placebo ads through the systems, but not tell the attribution vendor. And so when they saw thousands of sales coming back from a blank ad, a placebo ad, they said, there's a problem here. And it allowed to and unlock the insight of 5 core flaws that again, we can show the paper, you can search for it in the Wonk's group. The first one was that there's a bias towards cheap inventory, because you're more likely to have a cheap inventory end up on somebody's device ID or cookie ID, and even though without a control group, you would see that was potentially driving results. And then there was targeting biases, and there are several other biases. And I think missing the brand equity part, question from an earlier panel, is absolutely one of the biases or the ways that you could begin to adjust for it. So. We still have a lot of work to do as an industry to, first of all, make sure that everyone's aware of some of those things, and to make sure that we've come up with approaches, whether it's use of control groups or some other approach, to deal with it. And I hope that that's what comes out of this dialogue here.
One of the key beauties, I think, of NCS data is that we don't just have big data. And I've said this all the time. Big data requires small data to be smart. And having access to all of Nielsen's panels gives us, and with overlap. So for everything we measure, we have except for one. We have big data and then we have small data. So we have our frequent shopper cards, 90 million households. And then we have home scan. And same with TV. We have our set-top box, and then we have NPM. And we can look at those same households. Are we collecting the right information? What do we miss? Mostly what it tells us is what are we missing? What are our biases? What's wrong in our data? And what do we have to account for? And that's a huge benefit, to be able to understand the places that you've got data missing, the places that data are.
One of the big challenges I see is connecting together the different exposures across devices. What are the solutions you see out there, and how are folks doing that today?
Well, ideally, you do it with as direct as possible.
Yeah, I think the Mobile Marketing Association got it right when they said we're moving away from cookies towards universal IDs, and I think that's absolutely accurate. But they're not all created equal, and we've seen huge swings in ROI understanding based on just how accurate those IDs are connected, just whether they're deterministic, probabilistic, and the level of precision. And that's something nobody's really talking about.
Huge problem in the quality of.
Neustar obviously bought market share because we have a universal ID, and now we have capabilities to do marketing analytics on top of it. So we get the importance of a universal ID. I do think, though, that even though we might be one of the bigger sources of deterministic ID, there is a role for probabilistic ID as well, because rather than just thinking about connections that you cannot establish through a clear email address or home address or phone number or whatever it is, that connection isn't there, it's important to have an overlay of the things that are not deterministic, but you can't treat them the same. You have to know upfront.
There's huge biases in the difference, and that's a place where I don't think we've done enough work. Where we don't build in those differences in the kind.
I agree. It's
not well known.
It has to be part of the modeling exercise.
It's not well measured. It's not well discussed.
I think we should talk about more, and this is a good start. I mean, with the work that we're presenting tomorrow we're the ROI measurement partner of record for the SMOC's work that the Mobile Marketing Association is doing. And we use Neustar data in the stuff that we're presenting tomorrow, and one of the panel topics tomorrow is about how that helped and why more people need to be using an ID like that. We also use LiveRamp, competitor to Neustar, and I think that's a huge progress forward. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the issue with the deterministic and probabilistic shows up most with Nielsen Television and the RenTrack or ComScore TV and the set-top box that Viant talked about before, and Vizio and others that provide that, where you can get different views for the same media buy, depending on whether you're looking at the Nielsen data, the ComScore and set-top box data, which comes from the set-top box, and while they try to do cleaning rules and other things to make sure that the TV was on when the set-top box was recording things, there's potential issues there. And then you go to the data like, let's say you bought a Vizio TV, and that that's one of the devices that's monitoring it. You have in one room, but not in all the rooms of the house, so which room is it in? And once it's on, is it my wife watching? Is it my boys watching ESPN? My wife happens to be in the room co-viewing. Am I watching it? That pattern, which then ultimately leads to, even if you got all the way down the household, you may be making a probabilistic determination based upon what's on, and you might be using that small data of the Nielsen part where people have to be logging in of who's watching what when. And I think that there's a lot of work to do to try to make that easy.
Who doesn't ever who is never included in the probabilistic models? Apartment buildings, center of cities. It's great when there's a house and people come home and they always come to the same home. But think of an apartment. I mean, the biases that are built in are quite large. So we don't understand enough about that, I think. I think it's a place where the quality of the data is substantially different. It'd be great to understand more about how to use them.
Yeah, because we don't have a ton of time, I would love to just have maybe each person just sort of say, what would you advise people sort of watch out for? What kind of mistakes can be made out there that people should try to avoid, just from a methodological standpoint, if they're really trying to avoid misattribution? We'll start, Michael?
Start with me. I'll try to tie it back to where we started. The goal is to recover this data generation process, right? And that's the consumer. That's what we're saying. And so how do we do that and do it in a consistent way? One thing to look out for is an approach that has two fundamentally different theories about this data generation process, and that's this idea that you take a marketing mix model estimated with some sort of specification of log or whatever that is inconsistent with the model that you specify for the consumer and try to bring the two together, right? You have a schizophrenic view of how the data is generated, and so one doesn't beget the other, and you have these sorts of communication problems when you're evaluating the effectiveness of media at a channel level that doesn't align with the attribution results, right? So if you have a consistent system, you have continuity from the channel manager in the way that they're evaluating the effectiveness of their media, the way that they're deploying that media to different tactics, and therefore augmenting the effectiveness of the channel. That sort of smooth connection is required. Without that, you have inconsistencies that give you suboptimal performance in data-driven decision-making.
Nancy, any words of advice from you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say what we've done even 2 years ago is not the same as what we're doing today, even from an econometric modeling standpoint. So we need to continuously adapt and evolve as the data changes and the needs of the marketers change. And I've been with analytic partners, running analytic partners for 17 years, and that adoption has changed what we do today and will continue to change. And if you're not set up to continuously adapt going forward, you're not going to be ready for the future. And that's really what we need you to think about. Some things that I would say, we heard great advice today, which is think of the question that you're trying to answer first. That's almost always never done. I hate the fact that multi-touch attribution and marketing mix modeling are commoditized into this thing we're going to buy to solve our problems, but the question isn't always thought about. And be careful about things like experimental design are great. I hear it's the gold standard. I don't disagree that it's fabulous because you can understand exactly what's going on, but it's not as scalable, and the data is not perfect. So those are some words of advice I would give. Pass it to you, Leslie.
What could I add? So, love the idea of ask the question up front. Understand why what you're studying and what is it that you're trying, what's the problem that's being solved. I would also say, for not necessarily the people on the platform here, but a lot of the attribution and a lot of the measurement of sales are not really incremental, and targeting is a huge problem. So if you want to know, did I get more sales from people who saw advertising, but you've targeted heavy buyers, you're always going to have a lot more sales among people who saw the ad than the people who didn't. And so you want to make sure that if you're really measuring advertising, that you're measuring advertising, not targeting. I would say that that's a
Sometimes you do want to measure both.
But
tease
know
them out.
what, and there's a question. So
Yep.
they should be distinctly separate. And the other thing, so there's one other call out I'd have. I don't think we've talked enough about creative, and I don't think we've talked enough about reach. And I think the industry's lost sight of both of those, and they're critical.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, actually, Michael and I were talking a little bit during lunch about creative. You know, creative gets lost in all this. We spend so much time with all this machination of trying to optimize placement and other things that we forget. Gosh, can you start with a good ad already? You know, some research that was done many years ago by my former company, Dynamic Logic and Miller Brown, showed that the impact of the creative, you know, is like 50 to 80% of the overall attribution.
Yeah, it's multiplicative, actually. And at the ANA Masters of Measurement, one advertiser after the other talked about they have 2,000 variants on a particular commercial, or 800, that each one has been specifically designed for the consumer they get. But did they start with a good ad that they're doing 2,000 variants on? Because a lot of the ads we see virtually do nothing. You know, they might speak to one small segment but you know, targeting isn't so perfect that those are the only people you deliver your message to. So the whole question of reach and the whole question of creative, I think, get lost in this world.
I agree with everything that was said before. I think when I try to evaluate my competitors' offerings, I typically first ask the question, so what are the things that we already knew as people with a background in marketing or marketing science? What are the effects that we know that really are in the decision-making process or covered by the solution that is offered? So what are the touch points that are covered? What are the idiosyncrasies or the effects of decision-making, like reach frequency, saturation, some form of forgetting or duration of impact and so on? How does the solution cover that? And then the meta effects of how do we get the biases that we already know? All of us know there are certain biases in the data. There's bias from targeting, bias from self-selection, bias from the fact that in order to make it into a digital attribution data set, you have to have gotten some form of an impression and so on. How are those things explicitly treated? The solution might not be perfect for it, but ignoring it in the first place and leaving stuff out and not talking about it, swiping it under the rug and hoping that nobody will ask, I think that's in my opinion, it's the biggest problem. And then as a cherry on top, I really like what I heard about what you said this morning or this afternoon about the ability to incorporate things like specific A/B tests into a methodology, not to have A/B testing as the only way of measuring stuff, but as the way of putting poles in the tent that holds it up and verifies certain crucial elements of the model. I think that makes it much stronger.
So Rex, a couple words of wisdom, Al, some thoughts, and then maybe we can go to the audience.
Yeah, you know, I have a little bit of a different perspective on some of them. I agree with many of the points. Start with the decision you're going to make or the question you're asking and who's going to take action on it. Creative, very important. You know, Karen, we work with Time Inc. as our measurement partner in something that I think Karen will be talking about. We find that message, being able to optimize near real time while the campaign's live at the message level has huge value. So I think speed is very important in these systems. Detail level, so you're down to the individual person, the individual message and that delivery, very important in these systems. And then I think the connection between what we've learned in our work with the Mobile Marketing Association is spatiotemporal data, where the person lives, how close they are to the store, how that affects their conversion and so forth. So this person-level modeling and analysis around that framework, especially if you sell in a physical world, and then the connection between brand and behavior, so that the model and the framework and the answers are consider the longer-term impact as opposed to just the short-term piece. So that's how we think about it in marketing evolution.
Yeah, and then I'll just add that, you know, alignment on the goals is really important. Sometimes we work with a marketer directly who says their goal is either to change perceptions about their brand or increase sales. Those tend to be the two things that those guys care about. But then you talk to their agency and they want to drive traffic or have click-through rates. And they get rewarded on it. They get rewarded on those things. And so I try to explain back to the brands, do you realize the people that are actually buying from us are rewarded on a different metric than you actually want them to be? So it's more than just know your goals, but it's also communicate and put up reinforcement structure in place around those. If we go to some questions, I think we have a couple mics in the audience. If anybody has questions.
Hello, Rick Brunner from Viant on the Wonks list. I wanted to drill in a little bit, if I could, into the questions around, the effect of the targeting and the effect of the creative. Representing a media company, Viant, and one which is a Time Inc. company, I should reiterate. We have invested in our research, as you saw in our presentation, in experimental design and real random controls. I come to the conclusion regularly that where campaigns are not especially successful, what I'm measuring the effect of is the creative, because our technique mirrors the targeting exactly, and we serve a placebo to the control group. And we are the media company, and we basically, the interpretation of that is, oh, my campaign was not successful by the advertiser. But the media company, we have brought them a very large-scale audience and precision targeting, and that doesn't get recognized in that kind of framework. So we are looking at a 4-cell design where we're testing also for the effect of targeting versus the effect of the creative, and trying to figure out how to incorporate that into a standard understanding of a return on ad spend model. If the control group in the standard framework where the targeting is identical represents what you would have gotten to the exact same target audience absent running the advertising, from the advertiser's point of view, that may be, what I bought when I paid for the advertising, but you paid a lot of money to the media company who brought you something else that doesn't get recognized by that metric, if you follow me.
So we've done a lot of work right in this particular area. We call it purchase-driven planning, and there's certainly not anywhere near the time to talk about it. But I would also say picking the wrong target is a huge problem today. If you advertise to people who don't buy the brand, because there's a huge belief that it's a leaky bucket, we have to go get trial. The biggest lifts come from your actual buyers. And if you putting the consumer in the center is so important. When we start advertising to our non-consumers, we can't expect advertising to do the kind of job that it could do. So sometimes it's the creative was written to drive sales among people who love the brand, and then they advertise to people who don't. It all has to be lined up together and all be working together in the same way. It's not just targeting or just creative. It's what kind of targeting and what kind of creative, and are they all synergistically and aligned?
And a really sharp answer to that question is that the design of experiments is a great place to start. But I know what we found, actually, I think you were Yahoo at the time when we first found this. We were doing work with P&G, and they were looking at CDI versus BDI targeting. And it was for one of their shampoo products. What we found was that people who were not heavy category buyers, or they were heavy category buyers but not of their brand, needed higher frequency before that message would change behavior. And so sometimes in an experiment, what you want to do is match that with the ability to look at individual frequency of impact. And as we're finding with our work with Time Inc. is you really need to be able to get the answer while the campaign's still live. Because coming at the end and saying, guys, sorry, didn't get any ROI, it's actually your fault, your agency's fault, it's the creative. No one likes that answer. So having a system that can turn around the answers quickly enough, and telling the market, I think with the Toyota one that was public, they had 5 different ads that they're running in magazine. They had several in digital. Now you have a chance that something's going to work, and we're going to find which audience, and you can adapt while you're in campaign. So I think in campaign optimization, I think you're doing the right thing with the experiment, but I just extended a bit more to look at frequency and to make sure you've got more cells and more creative to be able to work with to optimize it.
I would also say that the experiment can be leveraged within the modeling framework, right? So it's like, here we've disentangled two things, modeling framework and data, and the experimental variation of the data that allows us to identify the incrementality. And these aren't different things. Let's make use of this experimental variation in a well-designed experiment to identify the effects within the model, because we can deal with the non-randomness in the eligibility of those that showed up for the experiment, right? It seems like we ignore that when we talk about A/B testing. People aren't there randomly. The subjects aren't. They're not well selected. We can control for that in the context of a model. That corrects for a lot of these issues that we see in well-designed experiments and isolated settings.
One more question here?
Yes, so depending on, I guess, the industry, for a CPG brand or a brand where you're agnostic about where it's bought, I can see we're driving to the metric of did sales happen. But for places like a Best Buy, places like that are more about store visitation and hoping that eventually you buy something, should media companies be just held accountable at the store visitation level rather than being driven to the sale, if that makes sense? Because you have a retail experience that may or may not deliver as to why somebody didn't purchase, but your media, your platform, your whatever, got that person to the store.
I think, I would just say, I get the question. I think there's this parallel between, in the old days, you know, do you hold yourself accountable to drive someone to a website, but it's the conversion that is really up to whoever designed the user experience. In the same way, there's this parallel. Hey, I can get someone to be in a Best Buy or Nordstrom, but whether they purchase something or not depends on how well the product is displayed, what the customer service is, and things like that. So I think it's something to consider, but ultimately, you really care about the purchase lift, but if for whatever reason you can't get it, probably store visitation.
I would think you want to do both.
Yeah,
In an ideal world, at least, if you can afford it, you want to see whether your marketing drives people to the store and then whether they buy. And if you already have the machinery set up, it's just a matter of having another conversion metric that then needs to get an underlying MTA or attribution model. So I would think in an ideal world, you would have a model for store traffic and a model for conversion, actual purchase conversion, and maybe something even beforehand. We often have outcome variables for digital advertising that are some digital outcome, some engagement on a website, and then you go one step further and ask, okay, now that second one, how do I tie it to sales?
So I disagree. I think you need one model, though, and we work with Best Buy, and I think you have to be able to see where in the path to purchase a person got stuck. I think we agree upon that point. I think we would take a different methodology to it, but you know, it's incredibly important to know, is your problem a conversion problem because of an in-store experience, or the brand perception that people went into the store with in the first place that caused that sales not to happen? So our view is at a person level, you're tracking, you know, the path to purchase, and you're defining up front what success is, and you might be tying your bonuses to that, but you have diagnostics that are helping you understand where things get bottlenecked.
Right, guys, I think we're
I have
out
one
of
more
time,
question for the audience. If somebody knows who the guy in my picture is, I would like to know.
This attribution.
Oh, wow. All right, we're out of time, but thanks a lot, guys. That was great.